We were told a story. From the moment we were old enough to dream, we were handed a script: work hard, get the degree, land the job, find the one, buy the house, raise the family, retire rich, then finally be happy. And so, like faithful actors, we took our places. We performed, we chased, we waited. But somewhere along the way, something felt off. Because for many of us, the happiness we were promised always stayed just one step ahead. Like a mirage shimmering on the horizon, fading every time we got close. You get the promotion, but the satisfaction is short-lived. You find love, but it's complicated. You travel the world, but return home with the same emptiness you left with. It's as if we've all been running on a treadmill, sweating, pushing, striving, without realizing the scenery hasn't changed. And the most painful part, we've come to believe that this is normal. That happiness is something earned, delayed, even deserved, but never something we already have. But what if that entire story was wrong? Imagine this. A monk sits by the river, watching the water flow. No phone, no timeline to check, no milestones to reach. Just him and the breath he's aware of. In that stillness, there is no striving, no illusion of when I get there. There is only presence, only being, and yet there it is, peace, joy. The kind of quiet happiness that doesn't flash or dazzle, but gently fills the soul. Not because he found happiness, but because he stopped looking for it. You see, we've mistaken happiness for a prize. We treat it like something outside ourselves, like it's hidden in some future achievement, or locked behind a door labeled success. We measure it by what we own, who we impress, or how much we accomplish. But deep down, we know it's never enough. There's always someone richer, always someone more admired, always one more goal to tick off. And still, something inside us whispers, "This can't be it. This isn't a new problem." Even 2,500 years ago, Siddhartha, the one we now call the Buddha, saw the same pattern. He was a prince surrounded by luxury, opulence, everything the world said should bring joy. But his heart ached with a deeper question. If I have all this, why do I still feel restless? So he left, not to find more, but to find less. And what he discovered turned the world upside down. That happiness isn't a destination. It isn't waiting at the end of some path. It is the path. Let that sink in. The world told you happiness is something to chase, but the Buddha whispered, "Stop running, you're already home." And yet the illusion is persistent. Our culture praises the hustle, glorifies the grind. We're taught that joy is a reward earned through suffering, bought with success. But have you noticed? The happiest moments are never the ones you chased. They're the ones you didn't plan. A laugh shared over tea, the smell of rain on warm pavement, the quiet peace of doing absolutely nothing and being okay with it. These moments don't shout, they whisper, but we're often too loud inside to hear them. What if the secret isn't to try harder, but to stop trying so hard? What if happiness isn't found in achievement, but in awareness? Not in arrival, but in attention? The truth is painfully simple. We've been chasing happiness as if it's ahead of us when it's been quietly walking beside us the whole time, waiting to be noticed. Like a friend whose hand you never realized you were holding. So ask yourself, if nothing in your life changed, could you still be happy right now? Not tomorrow, not when the bank account grows or the scars fade, but now, because that's where happiness lives. Not in some imagined future, but in this breath, this step, this sip, this silence. The illusion we all believed is fading, and in its place, something real begins to emerge. Not a flashy promise, but a subtle truth. Happiness isn't a finish line, it's the ground beneath your feet, the path itself. All you have to do is walk it. Somewhere deep down, we all sense it. This subtle pull, this itch beneath the skin, that low, constant hum telling us we need to keep moving, keep climbing, keep doing. more. It's in the way we scroll endlessly, as if the next post might contain something that finally makes us feel whole. It's in how we wake up already behind, already late, already not enough. And by the time we lay our heads down at night, there's this strange sense of failure. Not because we didn't do anything, but because somehow we didn't do enough. But who defines what enough is? The world does. A world designed to keep you chasing, not because it wants you happy, but because it wants you consuming, buying, proving, comparing. It's an endless game, and the rules are simple. Happiness is always just one step ahead. Get the car. Now get the better one. Find love. Now make it look perfect. Got a job. Now grind for status. And when you finally hit those goals, they move the finish line again and again. Society feeds us a dangerous lie. That happiness comes from external success. That if your life looks good, it must feel good. But look closer. How many people do you know who seem to have it all, but are quietly falling apart inside? We post highlight reels and pretend we're thriving, while inside we're anxious, lonely, burned out. And the cruelest part, we blame ourselves. We think we're the problem. That maybe we just haven't worked hard enough, or smart enough, or fast enough. But the truth is, you're running inside a maze that was never meant to end. The Buddha had a word for this kind of suffering. Samsara, the endless cycle of craving and becoming. It's like chasing the wind. The more you run, the more it slips through your fingers. He saw that we are trapped by our own wanting, always thinking, when I get this, then I'll be happy. But when we get it, the mind simply replaces it with the next when. Think about it. When you were a kid, you just played. No reason, no reward. You were present. But somewhere along the way, you learned that joy needs a reason. You were taught to measure yourself against others. Grades, looks, likes, status. And so began the race. But no one told you that the finish line keeps moving. No one warned you that running would become the habit of your life. And now here we are. Adults who forgot how to sit still, who feel guilty when we rest, who feel worthless unless we're achieving something. So we run, even when we're tired, even when our hearts beg us to stop. But what are we really chasing? Validation, security, love. The Buddha taught that all of these are already within us, that the more we look outside ourselves, the further we drift from our true home. Because here's the paradox. The more we chase happiness, the more we affirm we don't have it. And in that grasping, we suffer. But there's another way, a quieter way, a path not of chasing, but of returning to yourself, to this moment, to the breath, to the now. Not because it's exciting, but because it's real. No filters, no scoreboard, just life as it is. That's where peace begins, not with a breakthrough, but with a breakdown of all the illusions we were told to believe. The world keeps us running, but it's your awareness that helps you stop when you begin to see the chase for what it is, an illusion fueled by fear and false promises. You stop running not because you're weak, but because you're finally strong enough to walk away. You don't have to keep chasing a life that isn't yours. You can choose stillness. You can choose enough. You can choose now. And in that simple shift, something sacred begins to bloom. Not the loud happiness sold in commercials, but the quiet joy of being alive, of breathing, of not needing to be anywhere else. Because in truth, you were never behind. You were never broken. You were never lacking. You were just running in circles, trying to arrive somewhere you already are. Somewhere maybe right now. You're waiting for something, for the message that makes your day, for the paycheck that solves everything, for the love that finally stays. We wait as if life hasn't started yet, as if the present is just a hallway we pace through while we wait for the real thing to begin. But here's the truth no one told us. Life doesn't begin someday. It began already. This right now is it. And the moment you truly realize that, you stop missing your life, because that's the real tragedy. It's not that happiness is rare. It's that it keeps showing up and we're too distracted to notice. Think about how much of your life has happened while your mind was somewhere else. You were eating lunch, but really thinking about emails. You were walking outside, but scrolling through someone else's world. You were with your loved ones, but mentally already in tomorrow. We live everywhere except where we are, and in doing so, we step over the very thing we're looking for. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." He wasn't offering a motivational quote. He was handing you the key to joy, because this moment is the only place happiness has ever lived. Not yesterday, not after your next goal, but now, always now. Happiness is not something you earn, it's something you enter, and the doorway is presence. Let me tell you a story. There was once a student who traveled across mountains to find a Zen master. When he arrived, he asked, "Master, how do I find peace?" The master replied, "Have you finished eating?" The student nodded. "Then wash your bowl," the master said. That was the teaching, so simple yet profound. Because joy doesn't wait at the end of a pilgrimage. It's in the washing of a bowl, the breath before you speak, the light spilling through the window. It's not about doing more. It's about doing this, whatever this is, with your full attention. We keep thinking the big moments are what matter most, the graduation, the wedding, the promotion. But life is made of ordinary things. And when you're truly present, even the ordinary becomes sacred. When you eat, just eat. Feel the warmth of the food, the textures, the nourishment. When you walk, just walk. Notice the earth beneath your feet, the sky above your head. When you breathe, really breathe. These are not spiritual gimmicks. This is the art of being alive. Because every time you return to the present, you're returning to yourself, and in that return, you find that happiness was never lost. You were just distracted. It's so easy to miss it. Not because joy is hidden, but because we're always somewhere else. We're addicted to what's next. We think fulfillment lives in the next chapter, the next version of ourselves. But what if this version of you is already enough? Not someday, now. No upgrades, no achievements, no perfection required, just this moment, this breath, this very heartbeat. It's simple but not easy, because the mind will pull you away again and again, into worry, into regret, into endless noise. But each time you come back, you wake up a little more, like clouds parting after a storm. You begin to glimpse the sky that was always there. And here's the miracle. You don't have to go anywhere to find peace. You just have to arrive where you already are. Because in this ordinary moment, right here, right now, if you're truly present, you'll notice something incredible. You're not waiting anymore. You're not chasing anymore. You're just living. And in that simple act, you found what the world told you was somewhere else all along: happiness. We tell ourselves stories like, when I have more money, when I'm in the right relationship, when I lose weight, get promoted, move to a better city, then I'll be happy, then I'll feel whole, then life will finally begin. But then never comes, because no matter how much we gain, it never feels quite enough. The salary grows, but so do the bills. The love arrives, but so do the fears. The goal is achieved, and then another appears, higher, shinier, more demanding. We live as if joy is locked behind a door, and we just need one more key. But that door, it's an illusion, and the keys are infinite. This is the trap of when I have enough. A prison built not of walls, but of conditions. We attach our peace to outcomes. We tell ourselves, happiness lives on the other side of change. And so, life becomes a negotiation, a constant bargain with the universe. If you give me this, I'll give myself permission to feel okay. But have you noticed, Even when you get what you wanted, it never really satisfies. Why? Because the mind doesn't want happiness. It wants more, and more has no finish line. The Buddha called this tanha, craving, thirst. It is not desire itself that causes suffering, but our belief that fulfilling the desire will bring lasting happiness. It doesn't. It only sharpens the hunger. Picture a man lost in the desert. He sees water shimmering in the distance. He runs toward it desperate, but as he reaches it, it vanishes. It was a mirage. So he sets his eyes on the next shimmer, and the next, and the next. He dies of thirst, chasing illusions that never quenched him. We are that man, only our desert is not sand. It's the endless terrain of conditional happiness. And the mirage, that's the lie that enough is out there somewhere. But what if you stopped chasing? What if you sat down right where you are and looked around? What if you discovered that this moment, imperfect as it is, already holds everything you need? That joy doesn't require a raise, or a better apartment, or someone else's approval. What if the idea of enough has nothing to do with what you have, and everything to do with how present you are? There's a line in the Dhammapada that says, "Contentment is the greatest wealth," not because it makes us passive, but because it frees us from the chase, from the lie, from the anxiety of never measuring up. So many of us are exhausted, not from life itself, but from trying to become worthy of it. We perform, we pretend, we push ourselves to become the version we believe will finally be good enough. But here's the thing. There is no version of you that makes you more deserving of joy than you already are. You don't have to earn it. You are it, right now, as you are, in this breath, in this skin. The moment you stop saying, "I'll be happy when," and start saying, "I can be happy now," everything changes. You start to see beauty again. You start to taste your food. You start to feel sunlight instead of rushing through it. Not because the world became perfect, but because you did the radical thing. You let it be enough. And slowly, the illusion fades. You realize that the treasure you were chasing was buried under your own feet. You just needed to stop long enough to see it. You've been looking for the door, the one that leads to peace, to quiet joy, to the feeling that you're finally home. And maybe you've walked past it 1,000 times, because the door to happiness isn't hidden in the future. It doesn't live in your achievements, your plans, or your someday. It's here, right now. The door is mindfulness, and it's always open, but most of us, we don't notice. We're too busy, too loud inside, too used to treating the present moment like something to rush through. We don't walk, we rush. We don't eat, we scroll. We don't breathe, we hold it. And then we wonder why we feel so far from joy. Mindfulness is not a new concept. It is ancient, and yet it is more urgent now than ever before, because we live in a world of distraction, a world that profits from our inattention. Every ping, every notification, every endless scroll pulls us further from ourselves. But mindfulness, it is the rebellion. It is the gentle, radical act of coming back to the body, coming back to the breath, coming back to this moment, the only one that's real. The Buddha taught mindfulness not as a luxury, but as the foundation of awakening. He called it sati, the remembering, not remembering the past, but remembering to be here, to come home. And here's the beautiful part. Mindfulness doesn't require a mountaintop. You don't need silence or incense or perfect posture. You can be mindful washing dishes. You can be mindful walking to the store. You can be mindful right now by feeling your breath move in and out of your body. That's all it takes. Attention, presence, a soft awareness that whispers, "I am here." Because when you are truly here, the future loses its grip. The past loosens its weight, and in their place something exquisite begins to bloom: clarity, peace, joy without reason, People think happiness is a high, but mindfulness teaches that happiness is a stillness, a quiet, steady hum beneath the noise. It's the kind of joy that doesn't need to shout. It just is. When you drink tea with mindfulness, you taste the miracle of water and leaves and time. When you walk with mindfulness, the earth becomes sacred again. When you breathe with mindfulness, you remember that you are alive. Not existing, alive. It's easy to forget. The world moves fast, and the mind, it loves to wander. But mindfulness isn't about being perfect. It's about returning, again, and again, and again. Each time you bring your awareness back to this moment. You're not failing, you're practicing. You're deepening your presence. And presence is the birthplace of peace. In a distracted world, mindfulness is a homecoming. It is the door that's always open. The silence that holds all sound. The breath that connects you to life itself. And here's the secret. You don't need to force happiness to arrive. You just need to show up. Because happiness is not something you earn. It's something you uncover. Beneath the noise, the striving, the craving, you were never far from it. You just forgot to look where it's always been. Right here, in this breath, in this now. We carry so much. Regrets, expectations, old wounds we don't talk about, stories we've told ourselves for years. Like armor we forgot to take off. And after a while it starts to feel normal, to feel heavy, to feel stuck. But maybe the problem isn't that we're broken. Maybe the problem is we're carrying too much. And no one ever taught us how to let go. We've been taught to hold on, to success, to security, to identity, to who we think we're supposed to be. We cling to the past, afraid to forget. We cling to the future, afraid to fall behind. We even cling to our pain, because at least it feels familiar. But what if happiness isn't something we find? What if it's something we uncover? Once we put down what's blocking it, the Buddha said, you only lose what you cling to. Let that echo. You only lose what you cling to. What if peace isn't hidden? What if it's just buried? Under years of holding on. Picture this. A traveler walks through the mountains, carrying a backpack filled with rocks. He doesn't remember when he started filling it. One rock for every regret. One for every time he wasn't enough. One for every betrayal, every fear, every expectation. And now every step is hard, every breath heavy. And he wonders why joy feels so far away. But no one told him. He's allowed to put the bag down. He doesn't have to carry it to prove his strength. He doesn't have to keep it just because he's always had it. He can just release it. That's the power of letting go. Letting go isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's knowing what to keep and what to release. You let go of blame and find compassion. You let go of control and discover trust. You let go of the story and meet the truth. But how? Not by force. Not by pretending things didn't hurt. Letting go isn't forgetting. It's no longer letting the past control your present. It's meeting your pain with kindness, breathing into it, saying, you're here, I see you. But you don't get to run the show anymore. It's recognizing that freedom doesn't come from fixing everything. It comes from making peace with what is. And yes, it's scary. We're afraid that if we let go, we'll lose ourselves. But maybe, just maybe, that version of ourselves was never real, just a layer, just a shell. And when you release it, something softer emerges, something truer, lighter, more alive. This is what the Buddha meant by liberation. Not some distant enlightenment, but the quiet, everyday freedom of not needing to grip so tight. Freedom from needing to be right. Freedom from needing to be perfect. Freedom from carrying the weight of who you thought you had to be. Because underneath all that noise, all that striving, you are already enough. You always were. Letting go is not the end. It's the beginning. The beginning of joy not based on circumstances. The beginning of peace that isn't fragile. The beginning of you. As you are, so breathe. Feel the weight you've been carrying, and imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to finally set it down, to trust that happiness doesn't require you to carry everything. It just asks that you show up open, empty-handed, and free, because only with empty hands can you truly receive. Most people chase happiness like it's weather, a warm day they're hoping will last, a passing cloud they're trying to catch, a feeling they think will finally arrive when everything is perfect. But happiness isn't a mood. It's not excitement. It's not the rush of good news or the buzz after success. Those are sparks, beautiful, yes, but they flicker. Happiness is not a momentary spike. It's not adrenaline. It's not dopamine. It's not the high. True happiness is presence. It's the deep contentment that comes when you stop needing life to be different to feel okay, when you're not bracing against reality, but breathing with it. Think about that. How much of your life have you waited to start? Because you were waiting to feel good first. If I could just get that job, then I'll be happy. If I could just fix this relationship, then I'll be okay. If I could just be more confident, more successful, more whatever. We live in a constant if-then equation, but happiness doesn't come after. It's not the prize, it's the path. The Buddha didn't teach how to achieve happiness. He taught how to be free from suffering, and from that freedom comes peace. Not the kind of peace that needs silence, not the kind of joy that depends on mood, but the kind of steady inner stillness that can smile even while things fall apart. That's not a feeling, that's a way of being. When you treat happiness as a feeling, you become a hostage. You depend on things going right. You fear loss, you fear change, but when happiness becomes your orientation, your posture toward life, then even sadness becomes sacred. Even pain becomes part of the wholeness. You stop asking, how can I avoid suffering? And instead ask, how can I suffer well? How can I stay open through it all? Because happiness, real happiness, isn't the absence of discomfort. It's the presence of honesty, acceptance, compassion. It's living life unarmored. And this is where the practice begins. Not in trying to be happy, but in living in a way that is grounded, awake, and free from the chase. You don't have to smile all the time. You don't have to feel good every morning, but you can walk with clarity. You can move with kindness. You can meet life as it is and not shrink back. And that is joy. The kind no one can take. The kind the world can't give you because it didn't create it. So maybe we need to stop asking, how do I feel right now? And instead ask, how am I being? Because the truth is, you don't need to feel happy to live happily. You just need to be here, fully alive, unafraid to feel, unwilling to numb, and open enough to let the moment matter. That's not a mood, that's a life. When happiness is no longer something you seek, but something you embody. You don't have to chase peace. You become it. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is part of being human. That's not just a truth taught by Buddhism, it's written into every life, every body, every beating heart. We lose what we love. We fail. We get sick. We grow old. We watch others leave, sometimes too soon. And still, somehow there are people who smile through it all. Not fake smiles, not denial, but real, quiet joy that lives right alongside the sorrow. How? Because joy isn't the opposite of pain. It's the space in which pain is allowed to breathe. See, most of us are taught to divide the world into good and bad. Joy is good, pain is bad. We run toward one and flee from the other. But what if the world doesn't actually work like that? What if the deepest joy is found not in avoiding suffering, but in being fully present with it, without running, without resistance? That's what the Buddha discovered under the Bodhi tree. Not that life would stop hurting, but that freedom is possible within the hurt, because suffering only becomes unbearable when we fight it, when we label it, when we fear it will never end. But the moment we open to it, when we hold our sorrow the way a mother holds a crying child, something changes, it softens, and in that softening, a quiet joy arises, not a wild, ecstatic high, but a deep inner warmth, the kind that says, even this belongs, even this is part of the path. Think of the last time you cried and someone just sat with you, not to fix you, not to change the subject, but to simply be there, fully present. Wasn't there love in that moment? Wasn't there a kind of peace? That's the joy we're speaking of. Not joy instead of suffering, but joy within suffering. Joy that comes from not abandoning yourself. When you're mindful of your pain, when you allow it to rise and fall without clinging, without pushing it away, you begin to see there is a stillness underneath the storm, and that stillness is joy because it's free. This is why mindfulness isn't about escaping life. It's about meeting life as it is. And life includes sorrow. Life includes grief. But joy, real joy, doesn't ask you to get rid of those things. It just asks you to stop hiding from them. And when you stop hiding, something inside you opens. The tight fist unclenches, the armor softens, the breath deepens, and somehow, you realize you can hold both the light and the dark. You can cry and still feel gratitude. You can ache and still feel alive. You can suffer and still walk in peace. The lotus flower doesn't bloom in clear water. It rises from the mud. And the deeper the mud, the stronger the flower. So don't curse your pain. Don't rush past it. Don't believe the lie that joy only belongs to the pain-free. Joy belongs to anyone who is willing to stay open in the storm, because even here, especially here, you can smile, not because it doesn't hurt, but because you are no longer afraid of the hurt. That is freedom. That is awakening. That is joy. There is a strange freedom that comes when you stop needing to arrive, when the mind no longer whispers, just a little more, and then you'll be happy. When the heart no longer clings to a future version of life, cleaner, brighter, more complete. Something shifts, suddenly the present moment. This one isn't a stepping stone, it's the whole path, and that changes everything. You begin to notice the way light falls through the trees. You hear your own footsteps. You feel the wind touch your skin. You're no longer marching toward some distant goal. You're walking with life, not chasing ahead of it, because there's nothing missing anymore. There's nowhere else you need to be. This, the breath you're taking right now, the ground beneath your feet, the silence between sounds, this is the destination. You see, we've been trained since childhood to believe happiness lives out there, in the next achievement, the next relationship, the next version of yourself. But no matter how far you chase, it always moves further ahead, like the horizon line you can never reach. What if there is no finish line? What if the journey is the arrival? The Buddha once said, "There is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path." That teaching is not a metaphor, it's an instruction. It means, walk not to be happy, but as happiness. Let your joy not depend on outcomes. Let it be in how you tie your shoes, how you sip your tea, how you speak, listen, breathe. Every step a prayer, every glance a gift, every heartbeat a homecoming. And suddenly, you're not waiting anymore. You're not striving. You're dancing with what is. Even your suffering becomes part of the dance, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a sacred rhythm to move with. You begin to smile without reason. Not because everything is perfect, but because you no longer need it to be. The chasing stops. The inner noise fades. You are here, completely, silently, alive. To walk the path with joy means this. You no longer see life as a series of tasks to complete. You see it as a sacred unfolding. Moment by moment, you no longer ask, how much further? You simply place your foot on the ground and feel the miracle that you can walk at all. And that is enough. There's nothing left to chase. You've arrived, you've always been here, and now you know it. You've been walking a long time, not just in this video, not just through ideas, but through your life, always walking, always reaching, trying to arrive. And now, you're here, not because something finally clicked, not because you became someone better, not because life gave you what you asked for, but because, somewhere along the way, you stopped running, you stopped fighting the moment, you stopped waiting for life to begin. And in that stillness, you heard something, soft, unfamiliar at first, but deeply known, a whisper beneath all the noise. You were never lost. You see, the search for happiness was never about finding something new. It was about removing what blocked your view. It was never in the next achievement, the next version of yourself, the next escape. It was always right here, breathing with you, waiting for you to slow down long enough to feel it. You were never meant to become anything. If this message touched something quiet in you, if it helped you slow down, even just for a moment, then maybe this space is meant for you. Here, we share more than teachings. We share reminders of what you already know deep inside. So if you feel called, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, not to follow us, but to walk beside us on this path of remembering, new reflections each week. Not noise, just stillness. Not answers, just presence. And until we meet again, may you walk gently. May you breathe fully. And may you always know you are already home. You were meant to remember that you are already whole, already worthy, already home. All the wisdom of the Buddha, all the practices, all the paths, they don't lead you to some far-off paradise. They lead you back to this very breath, this very moment. Because this is the only place joy ever lives. And the truth is, you don't walk toward happiness, you walk as happiness. You don't arrive at peace, you become peace. There's no need to strive anymore, no need to seek what was never missing. You have everything you need to be free right now. So what happens next? You live, but not as someone searching, not as someone chasing. You live as someone who sees, who walks slowly, speaks kindly, loves gently, and who knows there is no destination greater than the next step you take with presence. And so, may your life be your temple, your breath be your teacher, your presence be your path. There is no need to go anywhere. You're already home.